can please get a roll call? Here.
Present. Present.
Present.
Here. Thank you. Moving on to approval of the agenda. Are there any changes from staff?
I have no changes, Madam Chair.
Thank you. Any changes from the committee? And if not, can I get a motion?
Move to approve.
Second.
Got a motion and a second. All in favor say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Motion passes. Moving on to approval of the consent agenda. Are there items that the committee would wish to hear? Councilor Chavez?
Yes, I would like to hear more about item E.
Anything else?
I'd like to ask some questions on item D as in dog, and I'd ask staff to include me as the co-sponsor on the caption for item B as in boy. It hasn't shown up, even though it's in the resolution, the ordinance.
Did you want to pull it or just?
No, I just want to add my name on the co-sponsor for the caption.
Okay, so I have item D and item E. Any other items? And if not, can I get a motion to approve as amended?
Second.
All in favor say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Motion passes. Oh, I guess I keep forgetting to say aye. Moving on to approval of the minutes from the May 18th, 2022 Quality of Life Committee meeting. Any changes from staff?
No changes.
Changes from the committee? And if not, can I get a motion?
Move to approve.
Second.
And all in favor say aye. Aye. Any opposed? Okay, moving on to item 6, presentations. Our first presentation are findings and recommendations from the City of Santa Fe Violence Prevention Research and Development Process. We have Julie Sanchez from Youth and Family Services here to present. Oh, and also Sophie Andar from Independent Consultant, who they chose. Wonderful. Welcome.
Let's see. Oh, there we go. Awesome. So please do not look at my desktop. Good evening, Madam Chair, Councilors. I'm Julie Sanchez. I'm the Youth and Family Services Division Director for the City of Santa Fe. And I am incredibly privileged to have Dr. Sophie Andar here, who's been working with my division over the last 10-ish, 8-ish, since November. She reminded me since November on addressing issues of community violence within the City of Santa Fe. Initially, we focused on gun violence and youth, and it kind of really evolved into more looking at actually community violence across our city. And so without further ado, I'll go ahead and give the presentation over to her and allow her to introduce herself.
Thank you so much, Julie, and good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for the opportunity to speak with you today. I feel tremendously honored to have had the opportunity to work alongside Julie on this project, as well as speak with so many incredible community members. It's been a real privilege. Just so you know briefly a little bit about what brought me into the work of violence prevention. Like for so many, it was violence itself, and I was fortunate to have the opportunity to pursue a deeper understanding of violence and its prevention through healing in education. I pursued a doctorate in health education with a focus on violence prevention and have had the chance to learn more in subsequent roles in the anti-trafficking field as well as overdose prevention and different areas of behavioral health. So that's what brings me to this project. And move on to the first slide. So the project really began, well, I would say the conversations began to really flourish following the tragic death of J.B. White a couple summers ago. And there were some tremendous efforts to facilitate some healing and deeper understanding of what took place and how to prevent it from happening again. COVID then hit us, and there was some time of pause, although efforts continued in various ways. So I had the chance to re-engage the conversation in November, as Julie said, when there were growing concerns being expressed around additional shootings, especially involving youth, and a strong desire to really get ahead of this problem that appears to be getting worse. Certainly has been appearing to worsen nationwide and in New Mexico as well, where there's been about a 30% increase in homicides, as well as increases in aggravated assaults and hate crimes nationally. Here in Santa Fe, unfortunately, we experienced 5 more homicides than the previous year and almost a doubling of assaults. Of course, it's worth noting that so much violence doesn't get reported. So much of it is of a covert or hidden nature. So when the, excuse me, I'm having trouble. Sorry, so when we have hard data on how much violence is occurring, we can assume that it's really just the tip of the iceberg. And here's some data collected by SFPD to demonstrate that trend. Just to note the urgency with regard to young people, there is a perception that more young people are getting their hands on guns. One youth service provider I spoke with said that in just March, their staff and that person counted how many of their current clients have either a gun or have easy access to a gun, and it was about 41%, which this person, I think rightfully felt was scary. Young people are often out on the streets trying to protect themselves by carrying weapons. So the process that we took here was really to gather as much valuable information from various community perspectives, individuals with lived experience of violence, either as survivors or as people who formerly perpetrated violence or are in positions where they're witnessing violence or responding to violence firsthand, as well as conversations with various organizational leaders and folks who might be engaged in matters of public health and safety in more of a professional regard, and combining that with a dive into the most current research on best practice when it comes to dealing with violence effectively. Fortunately, we have a lot of that because violence has been acknowledged as a public health problem for more than 30 years, so the research is really well substantiated at this point on what works, although there's always lots of room to grow and lots of changing patterns. So part of this process was a bunch of anonymous interviews to really give people the space to share openly and earnestly, and then ongoing conversations with organizational representatives. So here are some of the organizations that have been engaged. I'm not sure if you can read the list there. It's small print, but a number of our organizations that are interfacing with very high needs folks when it comes to risk for being involved in violence. I want to share a definition of violence up front here just so that we're all coming from a shared understanding of what violence is. There's lots of different ways to define violence. I find this one's particularly helpful because it talks about the spectrum of overt and covert violence. It's by Professor Barbara Wallace, and she says, violence is delivering physical blows with or without weaponry, displaying and misusing one's power, or bombarding a person with destructive misinformation and myths so that, in effect, an assault occurs either on a person's physical body or to the self-concept, identity, cognitions, affects, and consciousness of the victim of violence. So violence occurs in invisible and glaring ways. The approach to the recommendations is to describe 3 different levels of priority that correlate with the 3 levels of prevention in the public health field. So starting with the most urgent level, critical, which this is tertiary prevention, and it refers to those who are most affected by violence. Those are people who are living with violence at home, people who are being victimized by violence, or people who are behaving violently. Secondly, and also very high level of priority, secondary prevention. The target population there are those who are in closest contact with violence victims and or people who are using violence, and also people who witness violence. And then finally, primary prevention, which refers to the whole community. That's your universal prevention level, because we're all affected by violence. We're all exposed to it in one way or another. So wanted to highlight just two of the top recommendations that are described in the draft that you've received a copy of. There's many recommendations, but these seem to represent some foundational first steps. The first one here is to establish and fund a collaborative city and county violence prevention unit. In the last several years, a number of cities that have been taking on the urgency of increasing violence and really recognizing what a harmful public health problem it is, they have established within their own municipalities government divisions that are dedicated to violence reduction and its prevention. This is also the top recommendation coming from the most recent guidance presented from Urban Institute on how to really get a handle on youth community violence. It's to build infrastructure so that capacity can be increased over time. So the violence prevention unit would include ways to collect and disseminate data and to analyze it, as well as to promote collaboration among community and other governmental partners to promote a coordinated response. This is needed because at this point we don't have a consolidated data system to track how much violence is taking place in all of its forms. I wouldn't say that there's any perfect data collection system for that anywhere because of the hidden nature of so many forms of violence. But there's lots of opportunities to increase our understanding based on the information we do have. There is a lack of infrastructure that's really facilitating a comprehensive and coordinated approach for local violence prevention. And we're in need of folks to really engage a violence prevention workforce. There's lots of jobs available that are currently unfilled and perhaps could be filled in the future to wrap more support around this problem. Here's just a highlight of some of the national best practices that are recommended for a city or region-wide community violence prevention effort. Investing in workforce development, something I just mentioned, as well as really leveraging community-based partnerships, building those partnerships, ensuring that there is strong community voice informing the approach, and also promoting a trauma-informed approach. Another top recommendation is to, in the spirit of, that's okay, supporting those who are at most risk for experiencing violence firsthand or for committing violence, is to support, educate, and employ a cohort of youth at high risk for violence to serve as community support workers and contribute to violence prevention once sufficiently prepared. So we know that mentorship, access to behavioral health support, access to basic needs that can mitigate health disparities, these are all meaningful engagement with peers and with safe adults. These are all things that can help young people reduce their likelihood of getting involved in violence. So this is a recommendation to really identify those young people who are at highest need and wrap support around them and to elicit their recommendations over time for how to best deal with community violence. Also, the need for this was really emphasized in the interviews that were held, which is, so some of these points are justification for why young people should actually get compensated to engage in such a program where they would be cultivating the capacity to work in a violence prevention type way. Many have noted that economic stress contributes to young people's use of violence, the perception that getting involved in selling drugs or guns can be a quick path, not only to having some economic gain, but a way of experiencing a sense of belonging from older adults who are manipulating them, or peers who might be projecting those as ways that, validate you. I think I mentioned this before, just how this matches up with the research and what we know promotes health and reduces risk for violence among youth. And the key thing here is that just as isolation, whether it's rejection from one's family or from one's peers, or stigmatization due to a perceived difference, or due to social marginalization, just as those forms of isolation really increase people's risks for becoming violent, connection and offering unconditional support are the things that protect us. And I think we all understand this at a pretty intuitive level after experiencing a community event that we find to be healing, or an opportunity to really connect meaningfully with others in a sustained way. With regard to the preparation of young people to become community support workers, this is hinging on a best practice model whereby credible influencers are identified in the community. So these are folks who are coming from the very neighborhoods where violence is most likely to be occurring. They are intimately aware of the local issues, and they are regarded as someone who, is worth listening to. They've earned the respect of their younger peers, maybe because they spent some time experiencing the consequences and have overcome those consequences. So the Cure Violence global model has been recognized as the most effective program for doing this, not only in U.S. cities, but also increasingly in international countries. So we're talking about a documented 40 to 70% reduction in shootings in the places where it has been rolling out. And it's a very effective model, so much that lots of different types of community violence intervention programs have adopted different variations of it. If you want to learn more about Cure Violence, I recommend checking out their website. There's the See Evidence page where you can read all up on their methods and their evaluations. So in conclusion, violence is a major issue that concerns us all in Santa Fe due to its growing prevalence and the toll it takes. I didn't go into this much, but to some extent, I don't think it needs to be said. At once, we have to bring greater recognition to how harmful it is. On the other hand, I think we are really attuned, sadly, because it's hard to go a day without having a tragic incident of violence in our place, even if it's not happening in our own city. The harms on mental health and on physical health are extensive and very long-lasting. Also, dealing with violence effectively requires specific prevention aims, dedicated personnel and resources, and a comprehensive research-informed and community-driven approach. While violence weakens communities and pulls people apart, strong community connections provide safety and support, helping to prevent violence. And to maximize violence prevention impact, there's a need to invest in community health and safety, workforce, and infrastructure development and sustainability.
So thank you, Sophie. That was a lot of information. This has been a really long project in the making, and I'm incredibly proud of the work that we've put into this, and actually incredibly proud that our governing body has supported this work so much that we've already begun our next steps, which is hiring a full-time program manager to really take these recommendations and build a sustainable program around how we intervene with incidents of violence in our community. Our other next steps is really, again, with the blessing of the governing body, we now have funding to put forward for these efforts and being able to support not only community providers, but also in building a program in which we have youth peer navigators who are able to work with other youth who are experiencing issues of violence. Right now and very soon, we'll be getting an MOU in front of you all, because now Santa Fe County also really wants to be a part of this work. And Santa Fe County is going to be contributing funding to, again, help support the youth intervention model And that's something that's forthcoming that I'm really excited about. And I'm also really excited about that partnership because, again, violence is not only in our city, it also extends to the county and extends to the state. And so finally, we'll have our final recommendations to you all by June 30th, and we will welcome your feedback on the recommendations. If you have any other folks that you want us to reach out to, it would be really great to have your input on those recommendations. And with that, I will go ahead and open it up for questions.
Wonderful. Thank you both so much for both the thorough research and the thorough presentation, as well as the work on this issue. It is unfortunately a very timely issue for this meeting, but I am very grateful to see that there's already been so much focus and so much that has gone into it, and that we are at a place where we actually are talking about next steps, which is really wonderful to hear. I'll go ahead and open it up to the committee. Any members have questions or comments at this time? Councilor Garcia, or Michael Garcia.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you, presenters. I appreciate the information. It's, violence is something that's plaguing society right now. And this is, I don't think anybody is shying away from it in a sense. I mean, you've got folks as young as elementary age. I mean, and in some senses, folks don't realize their behavior is violent. This is tough for me because, there was just an incident about a month ago where my child at school was part of a violent act, and her peer didn't realize that it was violent. My daughter was smacked upside the face, and her peer didn't realize that was not the appropriate action. And you see this happening all the time, from our young folks to our elders in our community. Nobody is shielded from violence, and this is an issue that we need to shine a spotlight on. We need to be able to provide the appropriate services and supports. And I appreciate the lists that are coming, the list of, I think it's 11 that's provided in our packet. I'm excited to learn about what's coming forth, because this is an issue that it's going to take all of us. We can't just focus on one sector, and I like how we're having the multiple prong approach, especially with bringing a cohort of young folks. Especially when you get into your teenage years, those are the most transformative and challenging times of a young person's life. They can make decisions that can really stray them in one direction that they might not realize is going to have a lifelong impact on them. And the more we can begin to develop programming to support folks all the way from the youngest spectrum to our elders in the community, and let folks know that there are supports, and how we are working to improve this horrible situation that's in front of us. I think the pandemic has really exposed where our gaps are. Didn't help by folks being locked up for a year and a half. I can only imagine the violence that went unreported during that year and a half. It's scary. I think we all could probably agree that lots of violence happened that went unreported for one reason or another, and it still happens to this day. I mean, I've got constituents that will reach out to me because they don't want to call the police because they're afraid, but they want to see some type of change. And I think that's where we need to begin to start moving towards in the sense of society, not us as a governing body, not as us as a city, us as a society to know that we are all here to support each other. We're stronger together versus isolated, and I think that's what made us 2 steps back with the isolation. Now that we're all back together, it's incumbent of us to tackle this challenge and really make an impact in folks' lives. So I'm excited about, thank you for all the work. I really am appreciative of this presentation because, as I mentioned, I think none of us can probably say we haven't been impacted by violence in our life. We all probably have our stories in one way, shape, or form. I gave you a quick snippet of how it impacted my daughter, and she didn't realize how significant that was. And that's all we got to do is just continue to put one foot in front of the other, and before you know it, we'll have made big impacts in this community, and we'll leave folks with the impression that violence will not be tolerated, and we are all going to stand against it. So thank you, Julie. Thank you. I forgot your name, presenter. Sophie, I appreciate it. And I look forward to what's coming down to this. This is great. I think you mentioned this is where we need to begin to focus some critical resources. So thank you. That's all I got, Madam Chair.
Thank you so much, Counselor. Counselor Chavez.
Thank you, Julie, Sophie. I always appreciate when you share your information. I have a comment. I really appreciate the emphasis on youth, and I'm going to say this over and over again. I think that we often get really concerned about violence amongst our adult community members and what we can do to prevent that from occurring. But to really make those huge gains, it's going to be really healing youth so they don't grow up to be in those shoes as adults. And really, that is how we truly prevent violence from growing in our population and in our community, is educating our youth, addressing trauma amongst our youth, throwing as many community resources at our youth. And I love the mentorship. I just had a conversation with Julie and Kara about mentorship. Connecting youth to a positive adult has just dramatic impact on trauma that a child faces. It's just so powerful because we often use, there's real barriers in our state in regard to mental health, a very limited mental health, especially for children. But I think something that we can do as a community, as a city, is provide them opportunities to meet people who could lead them down an appropriate path, a powerful path, a path that'll lead them to a bright future. So I really just had to emphasize my appreciation for the emphasis on youth. That is truly prevention. Starting with our youth when it comes to violence is what is the prevention in this whole process when we're talking about violence in a bigger picture. So I appreciate that acknowledgement. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Counselor. Councilwoman Villarreal.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you, Ms. Sanchez and Dr. Andar, for the presentation and all the information that you provided us. There's still information that I want to dissect through that because it was pretty rich and in depth. And I also wanted to suggest that request that this presentation be given to the Community Health and Safety Task Force. I think it would just help to enhance some of the work that we've been doing. And we do have presentations so that it's more informed recommendations, and this I think would help to add to the mix so we could connect with that. Can you say more about the City and County Violence Prevention Unit and who would make up that entity and then kind of its role in the community? Bless you.
Madam Chair, Councilor Villarreal. So the Violence Prevention Unit is a coordinated response. We're really going to be tracking data, doing addressing issues of intervention and then prevention. Because a lot of what happens is, violence is overlapping and it's intersecting. And so having a coordinated response is really helping address the issue at all risk levels, which start, as Councilor Chavez had said, it starts with our youth, starts at home, and then also can trickle into our schools and other areas in our community. One of the things that's really important is making sure that our efforts are coordinated with our partners at the county, and I would also imagine that we would have a seat at the table for the Santa Fe Public Schools and other, public institutions in our community. One of the aim of the Violence Prevention Unit, and honestly, one of the things that I would love to see is it be further developed through the Community Health and Safety Task Force, and maybe even be a subcommittee of the Community Health and Safety Task Force, because it's really going to be, created to promote, resource alignment, optimization, and efficiency on addressing issues of violence. And I think it's really important to have that part of the work of the task force. Do you want to add anything?
I guess I was wanting to see the connection with community. It's, I hear who would be part of it that would be instrumental in the coordination and then collecting of data. I guess I'm trying to also fold in or understand how it folds into the community experience with like qualitative data so that you actually hear from people that are most impacted by violence versus just government or institutions being at the table talking about it. So maybe you could share a little bit more about your vision for that.
Thank you so much, Councilor Villarreal. I think that's such a critical question because, as you just alluded, sometimes that gap persists even with best intentions to be responsive to community needs. So I think having a strong evaluation component would be necessary to ensure that data is coming from a range of meaningful sources, including firsthand accounts coming from all kinds of community members who might not traditionally find themselves at a government-involved convening. So just to point out some of those community-based data sources, to seek community members' input and agreement on guiding violence prevention unit principles and values. So what are community members who are already engaged in issues of community safety and health, what are they most caring about that the unit uptake in its approach, for instance, a health equity approach, applying a gender and racial equity lens, for example, maybe also promoting values of integrity and kindness. So that would be one aspect of input. As mentioned, the Youth Pilot Program would draw upon participants' insights and ideas on how community violence can be, how it's occurring and how it can be prevented and reduced. I think it would be important for the unit to have a presence in open community gatherings where there's an invitation extended. Those might include public meetings, health and education events such as health fairs, and events sponsored by the unit itself to promote violence healing and prevention. So you'll notice in the secondary and primary categories, there are recommendations around holding forums in the wake of incidents of community violence. So these would be opportunities for folks to come together who felt personally impacted, who felt moved by the experience to heal, to gain access to mental health or other types of services that they may need, as well as to really identify actions that they want to take and that they want to recommend that government bodies take. So I think, having a practice of eliciting and collecting information on needs and assets identified through community groups is really at the crux of this, and that would include, identifying existing local advocacy bodies like the Health and Community Safety Task Force. I hope I'm saying that. The task force that you just mentioned, the Community Safety Task Force, to really ensure that, whatever efforts are being put forward are one, best practice, but also really responsive to locally identified needs and recommendations.
I see the connection to, community groups that are actually more on the ground. I mean, the task force, obviously, we're made up of community members, but I'm thinking about people that are in direct conversation with youth and other people impacted by violence and how they can really get that information. Because, let's be honest, when people are talking about the kind of things that are traumatizing them in the city, they're not going to tell us. They're not going to tell staff. They're not going to tell PD. They're not going to. It's just they need safe places to be able to share the information so that we can then figure out how to solve these problems. But it's not just violence. I like how you took an intersectional approach about what affects people and how they end up being leading into violent ways, and just life, what in their life is actually the barriers to being able to thrive. And so I think those are important pieces in your research. The other question I had was, and I guess I was just trying to understand the connection between our community health and safety department, and then that is also included with, folks in the audience that are from PD, and how you all see that this information that you're providing and the data that you have collected, and also the recommendations, how you think this plugs into that department and PD specifically, and kind of their role in this, if you see that connection, if you could maybe explain that. Since we have a captive audience, I just want to see the connection from the research you do, and then how it applies to some of our departments and such.
Absolutely. So consulting with our law enforcement partners was a priority, just as it was speaking with advocates of those who are surviving violence. And so we consulted with various folks along the way to ensure that recommendations were relevant, and with specific respect to how to enhance the support for the police department around dealing with sexual violence, domestic violence, and human trafficking. So there's a focus there. So I would say, from my point of view, there's already been a strong partnership that has begun. But I think it would be important for this unit to be in regular communication with all kinds of units that deal with matters of violence, maybe not even directly, but indirectly. So, sometimes an act of violence shuts down roads and it's affecting public transportation, to really do a deep dive into how does violence affect all of the different public services that this department is, promoting and responsible for. So I think having an ongoing kind of feedback loop that would inform that would be a really important process.
I guess, I hear what you're saying about that piece, the public service, and I guess I'm trying to see how the recommendations could then feed into better practices in our departments or in law enforcement in general. And maybe that's what I'm not connecting yet. Not that you have to solve that problem, but I just want to see that connection. And maybe you could refer to a section that talks about that.
Absolutely. So actually, recommendation A5, so that's A, priority level critical, and recommendation number 5 is to include fund technical assistance for the Santa Fe Police Department to support an organizational culture assessment and change process designed to enhance workplace wellness and equitable and quality service delivery. There's a number of other areas that technical support could be provided, but I'll highlight that one because the focus there is recognizing that people working in, people doing police work are exposed to chronic stress and constant risk for experiencing trauma. And there are, due to a warrior mentality that's often common in law enforcement fields. I won't speak to if that's so present in our own police department, but it's certainly a a common trait among professions where people are expected to be really strong all the time in the face of tragedy. There's a need to really prioritize mental health and understand how is one's mental health doing, first of all, and how might it be impacting their job. So, for instance, if someone grew up in a home where domestic violence was recurring, responding to domestic violence calls could not only, expose one to trauma in that moment because you might be seeing something really horrific, but it could trigger a trauma memory from your own past. Well, many law enforcement folks are coming from military organizations where they may have trauma from their military experience. So I see the recommendation here, and it's reflected in recommendations that apply to all organizations that deal with violence later on in sections B and C, but really to prioritize mental health so that it's being well assessed to ensure that folks are really in the best position possible to do their jobs and with equitable service delivery.
Thank you, Dr. Andar. That was helpful. That was kind of what I was trying to see or understand in my head about the connection to our work and our departments. And yeah, I think I'm excited to actually have this maybe more in-depth conversation at the task force, and just appreciate the work you do, because there's just a lot of things that we don't know that our youth and people are experiencing in this city, and sometimes it's even microaggressions that come out. So I just want our youth to have hope. I mean, it's just really, I think all of us do, to be able to, hear what happened in the devastating shooting of J.B. White, and then the conviction of Esteban Montoya. Nobody wins in that situation. It's just, I think we all lose, and a young life is just lost, but another one is also lost because there was no other connection for them. So I'll stop there. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Councilwoman. Any other questions or comments? Councilor Garcia, Lee Garcia.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Just kind of to make a couple of comments, I guess you could say, and programs such as this I don't think can come any sooner or have been needed for so long. And when you take a look at where the community building is, and I think that's where a lot of this lies in terms of having things for our youth to be have access to, places to go, safe places to go. We hear it time and time again, people tend to gravitate to groups because they have a sense of belonging, and I think that's the same thing that happens in society. And if it happens to be bad, then it's bad. And terrible things happen that arise from these things. And so I guess one comment that I could take from this presentation, I meet with a SWAFA organization, which is on the south side of town, and they bring this up quite a lot. There's a young man in that group called JP. His name is JP Granillo, and I mean, he's very involved with this, trying to get these young people out and talking to them, and so I'm sure you guys know all of these things. Going back to how do we create a society where there is less violence, and I think, in my opinion, it comes to strengthening our sense of community, our sense of family, and our sense of belonging to the right things. And so I think that's where we're headed, and I kudos to you guys for that. The last thing I had a question on, and in regards to your presentation, so you did mention that there's no consolidated data system to track how much violence is taking place. Is that something that is currently in the works, trying to be worked on? You hear that time and time again between organizations. We have the data here, but we don't have it there, and they're not communicating. And so is it just not available, or it's just not put together?
I think it's a combination of both. Councilor Garcia, thank you for your question. The Department of Health gathers certain forms of injury and violence data and disseminates them. We have local morbidity data due to death reports. Those tend to, in both those areas, experience delays due to a chronic kind of lack of capacity around data collection, although the data is there. So I think that there's a need to sort of expedite access to certain forms of data as well as connect them. But I would suggest as next steps around advancing that recommendation to really understand better from our law enforcement partners what they experience as barriers to collecting and sharing quality data, maybe gaps due to lack of capacity, including technology. Talking also with the Department of Health Injury Prevention Division to find out more about where they see gaps, and also identifying, what is it that we don't know that would be really helpful to know. So, for instance, in the cure violence model, if Santa Fe were to get to the point of deploying credible messengers out into the community who talk to people who are on the verge of committing a retaliatory form of violence, because that's most of the violence that is dealing with, violence that's intergroup, we would want to have a good understanding of where are most shootings occurring generally. What are the consequences around the circumstances around the shootings? But domestic violence, sexual assault, and human trafficking are three major forms of violence where data is traditionally hugely hard to get and to verify due to underreporting. So I think we have a lot of opportunity there to ensure that these major forms of violence are really incorporated into our overall picture of how much violence is taking place.
Thank you. Yeah, I think that's very important to be able to have accurate data and access to it. I think it's really important that we do work on this and get it moving along, because it's so important to have that information. And I guess that leads into where you say that there's a lack of infrastructure facilitating comprehensive and coordinated violence prevention efforts. And so here again, connecting the dots and making things work, I think that's really something that needs a lot of attention to, and organizations working together. So I think those are just my comments. You can see when school lets out, I think you see a lot of this stuff happen because now people aren't focused, and so let's get going, I guess, is what to say. So thank you guys for your presentation.
Thank you, Counselor. I just have a couple additional questions and comments. So one, I know that we have recently started, Julie, we were talking about this the other day, partnering with the Anna A.J. Institute that's doing a lot of work on adverse childhood experiences and what that looks like in our community. And New Mexico does see a very large percentage of individuals who have, gotten over that threshold of 4 or more that they tend to focus on. Although I would say that some of them, one ACE is bad enough. And so I'm curious about kind of backtracking. When I was in San Diego, I was working with a program with families of kids age 0 to 5 that we identified as high risk for the kids having a large number of ACEs. And so I'm curious about that really early intervention piece, working with those families and working with those children, starting to even look at how we build resilience in that 0 to 5 population and among those families, so that we can really work on those generational cycles of trauma. And is that part of what's been focused on, and who are the partners that have been engaged thus far in that area? I saw a list of some that I can guess, but I'd be curious to hear more about how we're getting into maybe the early childhood centers, into Head Starts, the various daycares. How are we really working in that arena?
So one of the, thank you, Madam Chair, I appreciate the question. I think one of the first key steps, in addition to really clarifying who are those core community stakeholders who are at the grassroots advocacy level, who are addressing violence and, advising on governmental responses to violence, in addition to putting that in place, I think an important next step would be developing an actionable strategic plan that would look at violence comprehensively to ensure that people who are in all three categories of risk, tertiary, secondary, and primary, are all receiving some kind of effective or best practice violence prevention intervention. One way that this is already covered in the recommendations, but in a non-specific way, is recommendation number B3, which is to continue to fund and expand violence prevention education practices and programs with demonstrated value in school and community settings, including those designated to A, assess and mitigate violence risk, and B, build knowledge and skills in social and emotional learning, racial and gender equity, identification of violence types, bystander intervention, restorative justice, and trauma-informed practices. So many of our community partners are already engaged in really tremendous work in these areas, and this is really a recommendation around scaling up that work.
Wonderful, thank you. I appreciate that, and really looking at what that wide net looks like. You know, I'm curious, and maybe you have the same filter that I do. I dropped my certification, but I was a certified health education specialist as well, and I come from the public health world, and trauma-informed is so prevalent in my world, and I'm curious that it seems like, it's really everywhere. We're doing, trauma-informed trainings, we're doing trauma-informed care, and I'm curious, how widespread do you really see it being in this community, and what are those opportunities for education? Because, as you mentioned, I think it's not just the gatekeepers, but also the individuals and how they understand what that re-triggering might look like, and so I'd just be curious to hear what that's looking like within the city and county.
So, Madam Chair, it's interesting you bring that up. One of the things that some of my committees and commissions are really focusing on is figuring out how to build education across free educational opportunities, not only internally at the city, but really across the entire community. I know that the nonprofits that I work closely with, a lot of them are very trauma-informed and do yearly trauma training, but that's only a small section of the nonprofit world that I see. Same thing with the county. My counterpart at the county that I've been working with requires actually trauma-informed care for her grantees. And so I'd be really interested to start, building that, not only internally here at the city, but also making sure that all the partners in the agencies have access to some sort of trauma-related training. Did you want to add something?
Just to add, I think that as you suggested, folks who are receiving services from provider organizations that are endeavoring to be trauma-informed or that would do well to be trauma-informed, I think they're the key folks to ask, about their quality of care and to learn more from sort of the health consumers' perspectives. I really like that point about building in to funding opportunities, some kind of accountability piece. But I think it's an area of ongoing education for us all, and also a limit to how trauma-informed we can be in a society where we're continuously being re-traumatized. But I think we all have a long way to go. Some organizations are prioritizing it more than others. There's a need to follow up with how those practices actually support being trauma-informed, not just having it in a sort of principle or, sort of guiding mission statement.
Yeah, thank you. And I think another place that we sometimes miss is youth recreation outside of nonprofits, like the sports leagues. Your coaches, I got to tell you, I have some dance teachers that did some good damage to me. And so how we start to reach all those other individuals that have a coordinated or like an organized impact on our youth, outside of the schools, outside of, city programming, but really how we reach into the broader community as individuals may not No. I could talk about this for hours, but we've already gone about an hour. My last question, one thing that we frequently talk about with trauma, with adverse childhood experiences, is the economic piece for families. And families that are experiencing, real economic challenges, there is higher levels of stress at home. You are more likely to see violence at home. I did see some pieces in there of, different careers that we could get into, affordable housing, but I am curious about the coordination between city, youth and family services and economic development department, and also how that coordination might, you probably don't know, but might be happening at the county, because I feel like that's a really important component of this when we start to talk about the environments that people are in, and it's both the environment as a wider community, but also their individualized environments, and how we are supporting there and really looking at those connections there. So has that conversation started to occur yet? Julie's like, have you met me?
Thank you, Madam Chair. I actually have a meeting with Rich later this week to talk just about that, the intersection between economics and trauma and poverty and, violence. So you were right there.
As always, thank you, Julie. I really appreciate it. Well, thank you both so much. I'm sure that I'll be reaching out to you again, but and I look forward to bringing this back to quality of life as we continue to have this conversation, and thank you both so much for your work and for the presentation. All right, moving on to our next presentation, we have sanctioned camping in Santa Fe, recommendations and solution. Director Ochoa, Community Health and Safety is here, Julie Sanchez, Anna Kale, and it also looks like Hank Hughes, commissioner, but not wearing his commissioner hat, is also here to support. So, take it away.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you for recognizing Hank Hughes, who's here also to answer any questions that may arise in his role as the Executive Director of the New Mexico Coalition to End Homelessness, who's been a great partner to us here at the city. So this presentation is a follow-up to an earlier one we gave to quality of life. In the interim, we've done a lot of work on honing in on exactly what a sanctioned encampment in Santa Fe could look like. And so we're here to talk to you about that tonight. And I'll turn, some of this was in our earlier presentation, and some of it's a recap, and some of it is new. But really, we wanted to lay out the why of this. What's the problem we're trying to solve?
Can everyone hear me? Okay, there we go. So to lay out a little bit of why we're here, we have a lot of folks in Santa Fe who are experiencing what we're calling unsheltered homelessness. So they're people who are, for whatever reason, not going into shelter. Those reasons can be really varied, and that's part of the challenge, right? There's not one solution to every person. We have people who don't go into shelters because they would have to stop using drugs or alcohol. They would have to follow certain rules. There's also a lot of folks that don't go into shelter for the very opposite reasons. They have no interest in being anywhere near any, drugs, alcohol, violence, any issues that might be happening within shelter systems. Let's see. The city of Boise, Idaho, had a rule on the books that prohibited any public camping, and that rule was challenged and went to the Ninth Circuit Court, where they ruled that it was unconstitutional. It was actually cruel and unusual punishment to criminalize camping in places when there was not adequate alternative.
As you all know, prior to the pandemic and the emergency proclamation, our policy was that no camping was allowed on any city property. And we did spend about $3.4 million a year cleaning encampments. Director Wheeler and her staff from Parks are here and can also attest that that was previously a huge heavy lift around cleaning encampments. Also public safety responding. It took a lot of our resources. Right now, however, we do see that public concern for unsheltered people. Most people who call in are worried about the people out there. I'll just say we have a compassionate community, but they're also frustrated. And given the hazards associated with unsanctioned camping and how high, for example, fire hazard is, we'll talk more about that, we're really seeing kind of an acute situation here. We have our constituent reports often noting that the people are seeing trash, needles, and are concerned about the impact of these camps on neighboring homes and businesses.
And lastly, for this slide, our current policy, which is in place per CDC recommendations when COVID began, does not legalize camping, but it deprioritizes the enforcement. That kind of puts us as city government in kind of a weird legal space, which is important to note.
So currently, there are 365 households in our coordinated entry system and only about 101 beds, shelter beds in use. Outreach workers estimate that there are around 150 people who are on the streets and other unsheltered locations in Santa Fe. Nonprofits who are performing street outreach, which include the LifeLinks PATH team, Youth Shelters and Family Services, Southwest Cares, and other community workers. MIHO, which is our mobile integrated health office, and also does some street outreach to camps to locate their clients. Those workers describe their biggest challenge to be unclear policies about legal camping and lack of resources to which to connect people. Currently, our city's CRM system reports 81 active encampment reports, 22 of which came in over the last 45 days. And since April 2020, a total of 291 encampments have been reported into the system. And Director Ochoa will talk about fires.
It's no secret that fire danger at this time is extremely high. Our fire department is seeing an increase in brush fires in the city, and that's a huge concern around how we need to move quickly to resolve this problem. Anna will talk to you about what other cities are doing around this issue.
Thank you. We talked about this a little bit at our previous presentation back in March. Las Cruces, New Mexico has the Mesilla Valley Community of Hope operates Camp Hope, which is a self-governing transitional outdoor living community that is sort of connected to their housing services, although it is fairly independent in its operation. There's about 50 people who reside there at any one time. They have a tents to rents program in which they're moving these people very directly from this camp where they're becoming stabilized and into housing. We also talked about Denver, Colorado. They have Safe Outdoor Spaces, or their SOS. They opened at that of June last year, and they have 2 locations that are in parking lots. One has 55 tents that are surrounded by fencing. The other site, each site offers electricity, porta potties, trash cans, case management services. In February 2022, Denver City Council approved an additional almost $4 million to expand that project. Another example that we came across recently was Sacramento, California. The city of Sacramento recently established what they call Safe Ground. It's a space that's in a city park that happened earlier this year in 2022. It is a tent camping situation. There is 60 tents, as well as fencing, toilets, services. They're working on establishing a car camping site that will be separate, and with plans that that site will later be developed into affordable housing. So as we're going to talk about later in this presentation, I think Sacramento is also really seeing that there's a need to address the immediate needs and plan for the long term hand in hand.
So really, this has been an evolving strategy. We had, as you know, our emergency proclamation coming up for renewal or going away on June 6th, and at that point, the deprioritization of clearing encampments will end unless we codify it in our city policy, which we're looking to do. We really don't want to just go back to the days when we're spending $3.4 million clearing encampments without giving people an alternative. So until an alternative is executed, we will continue to deprioritize the cleanup of encampments, except for in parks within 30 feet of the Santa Fe River or its contributing arroyos, or when posing a risk to public health and safety, particularly regarding fires. The fire department is currently sort of amping up its monitoring of these sites, and whenever there's evidence of a campfire or any use of fire, people are asked to stop doing that, and then if they don't, they are asked to leave that site. That's not an ideal situation. It doesn't prevent the kind of risk that we'd like to prevent. But as soon as we can get an alternative up and running, which I hope is very soon, no camping will be allowed on city property again, because we'll have an alternative to offer people. We are not under the illusion that everybody will take advantage of it, but it's a better place to be than just reverting to the past, is what we feel. We've done a lot to get here. We do have, very strong partnerships with other community services providers whom Anna and Julie and I meet with regularly. The coalition continues to be a really strong partner as we try to get a handle on who's out there and what they do need to be housed as part of Built for Zero. We're coordinating with funders such as Ancorum and the county and other foundations to really better align our goals. In 2021, we commissioned a study, which this body saw, on unsanctioned encampments by St. Francis Homelessness Challenge. A lot of people that contractor spoke to, she did a lot of outreach to people who are unsheltered, expressed interest in participating in a camp situation and following certain rules that we'll talk about in a bit. We did present, as I mentioned, quality of life in March. And then we really started rolling up our sleeves and coordinating with our city manager, our city attorney's office, the public works department. Sam Burnett and Melissa McDonald have been great partners in this, in facilities and parks, community development, Rich Brown in economic development, Alex Ladd in affordable housing, and Jason Kluk in land use, and other internal, external partners. How would we do this? What would be the considerations we need to take into account? So it was a pretty systematic approach. That was faster than I thought we'd get there. I know that you've been waiting in anticipation, but I will say that we developed a matrix of all potential sites that met certain criteria, and we honed in on the Midtown Emergency Shelter site as the best choice amongst those sites. We looked at parks in the city. We looked at open space for various reasons, including the issue of timeliness and the ability to pull this off without much more delay. We looked at Consuelos, and Anna will talk to you about that.
So Consuelos Place is operating the Midtown Emergency Shelter, which is, as you all know, was the shelter that was set up by the city as a response to COVID. And that shelter has continued to operate. It's been a wonderful resource to the community, has really changed the landscape of shelter in Santa Fe in a really positive way, and we see this as an expansion of that service. If we were to co-locate the encampment services at Midtown, where the shelter already is, you can have one sort of staffing model that essentially is operating indoors and outdoors. There's already a lot of the infrastructure in place to support that. They're already providing non-traditional, non-congregate shelter. This is really not all that different. It just happens to be outside. So this is a proposed draft working budget. I want to make that very clear. As we've been working through this, we're putting together and kind of sketching out some numbers to try to figure out how to make this happen. You'll see that there are some costs on here that we don't yet have. As this has been developing, we're gathering that information. But for, to give an example, for fencing, you can't really get a quote on fencing without knowing the area where you're intending to put it and the size and shape and structure that you need it for. So we're still working on gathering some of that information. We do have $1 million out of our ARPA allocation that's dedicated to addressing unsheltered homelessness. You want to add to that?
Thanks. I'll add that, when we looked at other sites, we heard you all loud and clear when you talked about wraparound services and the importance of making sure we have adequate support for the camp. The other options all required the camp to be freestanding with no co-location of a service provider. And there wasn't another service provider in town that was willing to expand on property or had the capacity to do that. So that would have meant a freestanding, adequately staffed camp would have meant essentially us creating city positions who would staff that 24/7. So that was another time consideration. It also wasn't a good use of our ARPA funding. So we do see this as, because Midtown is a temporary location, and we all know that we see this as a temporary solution that has a off-ramp that we hope will be more permanent. So again, our partners on this, our proposed partners are Consuelo's Place, the Midtown Emergency Shelter. The New Mexico Coalition to End Homelessness is currently the fiscal agent for that project. We would also contract with the LifeLink, who could do some additional case management on site. And, you know, when you talk to people who work with unsheltered folks, one of the biggest challenges they find is we couldn't find our person. We didn't know where our person was. That set us back 3 months, 6 months. They were in the wind. And, you know, whether it's MIHO or LifeLink, to have folks in one location is going to be really essential to getting them connected to longer-term services. Southwest Cares is a great partner in terms of harm reduction, needle exchange programs, HIV testing and other services, healthcare for the homeless, which now I believe has a mobile capacity in town, can also be a partner. And then finally, the Coalition, which has been an outstanding partner in helping people get housed long-term in terms of getting vouchers and that. That's not an exhaustive list. If there are other partners out there that want to help us with this, we welcome that conversation. What are the next steps for getting this done? And Julie, being the feet on the ground person that she is going to take you through that.
Thank you, Director Ochoa. So really our next steps are going to be applying for a permit from the state for the use of the city property, procurement of material and supplies, including tents, cots, and other supplies, procurement of other services, so, you know, things like porta potties, support staff, harm reduction services, again, fencing and security services, working with the film industry and how to impact the mitigation on that, toilets and hand washing units, and this will be a combination of both contracted services and the use of the city-owned mobile hygiene unit. There's also the installation of security cameras, activating camp stewards and our other park ranger supports, which we have one park ranger on board, and we'll be doing interviews this week for a second one. Activating the mobile hygiene unit, figuring out potable water supplies, protection from weather, and of course ongoing monitoring from the city, including, you know, myself and staff.
The rules for this site are simple, but not always simple, right? But this is where people who come to be there sign an agreement, you know, look at, yes, I'm willing to follow these rules, and then they're admitted, and then if they don't follow the rules, they can't stay. But no open use of drugs or alcohol, no violence of any kind, physical or verbal. We're going to look at limiting the site to no more than 50 folks and see how that goes. No children under 18, quiet hours, no intoxicated or disruptive behavior, all areas kept clean and tidy. Residents are to be fully clothed at any time if they're in public view or not inside their tent. So pretty simple basic rules that you know, would be required for people on the site. Also, fire safety. No open fires at all, no open flames, and we'll be working on additional fire guidelines in coordination with our fire department. So, you know, again, this is a solution that kind of breaks your heart, because it's not a solution. I'll just say that. You know, to have people that really we hope and wish could be housed living in tents in a sanctioned city encampment doesn't make me jump for joy. I don't think it makes anybody jump for joy. But it is a way that we need to fit into plans to end homelessness that we're already working on because of the issues with people who are unsheltered, maybe not trusting connection to services, We need to build on-ramps for them to create those relationships with folks that can connect them to what they need and build trust, really. I'm looking at Elizabeth here, who's a navigator for veterans, and she knows all about building trust gradually with people who have lost faith in the system's ability to get them what they need. It can be done with people like Elizabeth, and we have a lot of them in Santa Fe who do that incredible work. So that's what this is you're safe here, you can be here. You don't need to change who you are to be here. We just want to find out about you and what you need to get housed. And that's not probably something we'd say in the first sentence, to get housed, because some people are going to say, I never want to be housed, right? And we have to really work with that and figure that out. So how does it lead to more people ending homelessness? You know, it's again those pathways to housing where people can come in and have no wrong door. Maybe some people are very comfortable going to Pete's, which is great, and Pete's can help them get connected to housing. Some people do great at St. Elizabeth's. Other people are doing really well at Consuelos, where there are dorm-style emergency shelters. And some people just don't want to come in from the outdoors. And again, not everybody will come to this. If we have 150 people estimated out there and we're budgeting for 50, we'll see what happens. But I think we really need to understand that supporting alternative shelter needs based around the people themselves and what they say they need is one piece of a larger puzzle. So we need to create multiple pipelines from homelessness to housing. And one of those examples were the Santa Fe Suites. Some people came directly from Pete's Place into Santa Fe Suites. That was wonderful. Some people stayed in hotels for a little while, people that staff at Pete's never thought could stay in a hotel room, and then they were ready to get housed. And so it's really about working with individuals to get them what they need and increasing our system's capacity to handle the need.
And so this is one of my favorites, which is assessment and evaluation. So how do we define success with this project? Really, it's a decrease in CRM reports of encampments in locations across the city, decrease in time and money spent on clearing encampments in other areas, decreasing in encampment-related brush fires, increasement in engagement of unsheltered individuals with support services, also increase in the numbers of unsheltered people being housed, and really forging a longer-term solution with community partners.
We want to give you a vision of that. Anna's going to talk about the intended outcomes.
So Julie just spoke a little bit more about how we know that this is a successful project for the city. But as far as how that's a successful project when it comes to our larger goals of addressing and ending homelessness in Santa Fe, this really plays a really large role in that. Connecting people to services without requiring that they walk through the doors of a shelter or of the LifeLink or housing authority is huge. Street outreach is one of the best methods to get people directly connected to housing without requiring a lot of hoop jumping and re-traumatizing people. Neighborhoods feel cleaner, feel safer. This is also an important alternative to clearing encampments. I spoke earlier about Martin v. Boise, that court case. Many cities around the country are adjusting their policies and practices on how they're responding to unsheltered homelessness to be in alignment with that case. This also would show that the city is really engaged and responsive to concerns of unsheltered people, of housed people, of outreach workers, of people who are trying to get their folks into housing. And ultimately, this is really operating within the framework of Built for Zero, which the city has committed to.
So we do want to give you a vision of what's after this. A best practice could be, has been found to be co-locating different kinds of services on one campus or under one roof to support collaborative efforts that address homelessness and reduce barriers to those in need. This doesn't mean we need one agency doing it all on one campus, and parts of it may be appropriate to be on the campus and parts of it may not. We are actively engaged with our partners in envisioning this solution, looking at other models. Brownsville, Brooklyn is one, where we really have day services. where people can be getting connected to things during the day, and then there may be an encampment on that site, there may not, depending on what we find from the pilot project that is essentially this encampment. San Antonio, Texas, Haven for Hope is another model. But, ultimately, our community is going to have to decide what's right for us. I think Camp Hope is, in Las Cruces, if any of you have been there, it's a really impressive operation, and it has made a huge difference in the surrounding community and the surrounding businesses and residences in terms of people having a place to be. And I think whatever it ends up looking like in Santa Fe, it's going to be a Santa Fe model ultimately, but the key is to have our funders aligned in how we build this out, and also to really just engage with the community. We are proposing a sanctioned encampment that doesn't really require community engagement at this point. It's on a city-owned property. I'm sure people will be in touch with everyone, and you'll hear from everyone, as will I, which is great. But in terms of launching this, it's, again, something that we see going for a year and a bit, and in the meantime, we do need to create a process that is deeply community engaged around where this off-ramp is going to be. Where in our city is it going to be? Who's it going to impact? We'll do extensive processes of listening to people around their concerns, making sure we're choosing the right site, making sure we have all the funding in place to make it excellent, not underfunded. Really, we are working toward a new investment, jointly conceived and funded with community partners, including the county and Incorum and our foundations. We would release a request for proposal for a new facility on a suitable property operated by a nonprofit. And a nonprofit that is a service provider, not necessarily the coalition, which is really a coordinating entity and not intended to do direct service. This facility might include a sanctioned encampment, an emergency shelter, maybe congregate, maybe dormitory style, maybe both. Day services, potentially looking at harm reduction programs. We're looking at some programs up in Canada that have been going for 30 years that are to help alcoholics not die from their alcohol consumption, but use safely. For example, transitional wet housing. We could have permanent supportive housing for some of the hardest to house people on this site as well, potentially. So again, we would not be able to plop this in any part of our city without deep community engagement and extensive outreach. So that is the intention. With that, we will tell you a little more about where we are with that. If we go that route, this is kind of our next steps. Some of the criteria for the site, and what we're looking at. Finally, we're here to stand for your questions. I'm sure you don't have any at all. No, I'm just kidding. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Committee members, any questions, comments at this time? Councilor Lee Garcia.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I just have, I guess, comments and maybe some questions too. I think I heard you mention that there's currently 365 available units for people to be housed.
There's 365 households that are currently in our coordinated entry system. That's the system in which it's a waiting list. Essentially, it's a coordinated waiting list that helps those households then access housing. So that's 365 households in Santa Fe who are currently homeless.
Okay. And of the available places for them to go, we're pretty much full.
Councilor, correct. We don't have the exact number on that, but we do know that even people who have vouchers that will pay for their housing in Santa Fe are going unserved because we don't have units for them.
Thank you. And then, so, of those people that, they have to find either a tent or their car or just anywhere, I guess, to stay. Yeah, I think the community very much so is very adamant of seeing just people out on the streets everywhere. And I guess with the emergency the emergency proclamation, once that reverts, then, and it becomes unlawful for them to be out. Is that correct?
It's currently unlawful for them to be out, but the emergency proclamation deprioritizes cleaning up the encampments. We would anticipate our policy until we have the solution to kind of continue to be that, with maybe ramping up enforcement on fire a little more. I think I was talking to Director Wheeler the other day, and I think, if I don't misquote you, you said you're saving in Public Works about $1 million annually in not clearing as much as we did pre-pandemic. Is that accurate? So that, you know, sorry, I'm putting you on the spot, but so there's a cost to the cleanup as well.
I understand. I guess where I'm headed with this is just, you know, the biggest word that I'm searching for is compassion for people, and I get it. I mean, I see it time and time again where people just, you know, especially in the wintertime, they're really looking for places warm to stay. And I think our community, nobody wants to have another encampment in their backyard. And so, you know, going back, you know, I think it's just very important for us as a community to support programs that will help people get on their feet. And I think that's the biggest objective here, is to find ways that people can move themselves out of their situation and into a stable either house, and it comes with getting job opportunities, but you know, mental health. We've heard it over and over again. And so, you know, I commend you all for working on this, and I think it is something that our community is really reaching out to us time and time again in regards to what are we doing about this. And again, another program that I feel, how quickly can we get things moving, and not only that, but can we get to that time where, you know, we have minimal people out there struggling, you know, getting them the resources they need to get into jobs, get into a house that they can sustainably pay for the long term. And so, I mean, I just thank you for the presentation, and I look forward to seeing this continue. And you know, again, compassion. We do have a society of rules, and we have to work towards making sure that, you know, people are held accountable for what they do, but at the same time, do it in the most compassionate way that we can. So, thanks again.
Thank you, Counselor. Counselor Travis?
Thank you, directors, for that presentation. And I know, Director Ochoa, you said that this is not a solution, and I agree, like, none of us think it's a solution, but I think it's a step closer, because we're taking individuals in need and trying to isolate them to one location, and I think that's going to really test, do we have adequate services amongst the city, but also our community partners, and really testing, like, who's going to come in, like, what force do we have behind us in addressing this issue? So I just wanted to, you know, thank you for the work, but also shine light on that fact that this isn't the immediate larger solution we want, but I do think that the work that you guys have done is so meaningful, because I think it's a huge step in getting there. I really, you know, compassion, as Councillor Lee Garcia said, is huge, and I think we've approached, your thought process shows compassion. I think we want to see, you know, making sure we have the resources, making sure we have the staffing to get people back on their feet. And your plan really shows that. I think it's at the heart of the whole thing. It might not address everybody at once, but I really think it's a step forward, so I just wanted to thank you all for that work.
Thank you, Counselor. Counselor Garcia?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you, Director Ochoa, Ms. Sanchez, and Ms. Kale. And I appreciate you, as you mentioned, putting a lot of foresight into the wraparound services. It's critical. That's the make or break part of this. I did, after the presentation in March, get feedback from constituents with some concerns around allowing for usage in tents, and more so because this would be public or city space, the liability issues. If somebody were to get hurt or something, does the city become liable because we've allowed it? I didn't have an answer for that, and I didn't know if maybe you can expand, because I think that's probably the biggest concern I've heard from folks is out of sight, out of mind. Well, at the end of the day, it's city property. Are we liable, or what happens in that case?
Madam Chair, Councilor Garcia, great question. I think we have to do further consultation with legal on that. What I will say is, you know, to have Narcan readily available, to have staff on site, you know, there's not a shelter, well, there is a shelter in town, but many shelters experience on-site overdoses, you know, and other difficulties around drug use, even when they're prohibiting the presence of drug use. And having those folks on site is, you know, really helpful. But in terms of the liability issue, I'm sure it'll come up. I'm sure it'll come up when we go into our expansion of services and for the provider, and we may need to alter that. If we need to, we need to. But I guess the point is that people don't have to be sober to be in this space, and as much as possible, if they can adhere to those behaviors that we outlined, that's our focus. You know, to become part of a community in that way, to have respect for the people around you in that community and be able to function that way, that is our main concern and should be the staff's main concern. But duly noted.
And understandable. I mean, I'm just bringing the word of the public, and that way we can figure this all out together, because that's what we're doing. We're trying to figure this out together as we're going. And so I guess my next question, because we are figuring this out, and we do have the privilege of having, should I call you Commissioner, Executive Director, Mr. Hughes? Okay, Hank. So since we have Hank here, and Hank, as we're trying to put this piece together, this puzzle together, do you see any gaps in our plans? Anywhere we can sharpen it? Anywhere that can help us as we're planning out this future for us?
Well, thank you, Councilor Garcia. I think we have a great example in Las Cruces and the Community of Hope's Camp Hope down there, and I think the first thing we'd want to do is send any staff members we hire down there to learn how they do it, because it's very well organized. It's about the same size, but, you know, it's about the same size city. It's about the same size encampment. Of course, more people sleep outside in Las Cruces than here because their winters are so mild compared to ours. But I don't see any obvious gaps. I mean, I think the people behind me have really thought this through. The staff at Consuelos is actually enthusiastic about this because they see the need. They have a long waiting list for people who want to get into the indoor shelter. And I think they would love to serve more people. So, yeah, the only thing I didn't hear mentioned is I think we should send everybody to Las Cruces to learn how they do it, because it actually cleaned up the neighborhood around the Community of Hope, because people used to camp all over the place there, and now they camp in one spot. But that's the only thing I would add.
Okay. Thank you, Hank. I appreciate that. And with that, no other comments. Thank you, Director Ochoa. Thank you, Ms. Sanchez and Ms. Kale. I think this, as we're moving forward, it's going to be, you know, a situation where, as Director Ochoa said, lots of opinions are going to continue to come out, you know, especially since, I think it was in yesterday's paper, where we're looking at categorizing Midtown as blight. And I can already foresee challenges coming, and I think as we work together as a team on this and fully educate the community and let them know what's happening, I think folks will be comfortable. So thank you all for your time and effort on this. That's what I got, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Councilor. Councilman Vitarel will be right back, so I will go ahead with my questions for the moment. So I'm trying to figure out, I'm doing some math. We have 101 shelter beds in use right now, and there are 150 on the streets that we believe, or in other unsheltered locations, so.
Yeah, Madam Chair, that 150 is an estimate made by outreach workers.
Correct. And so if we provide space for 50 individuals, then on any given night, there's approximately 100 individuals that still do not have a place to go, or is there capacity within the shelters that could absorb the rest of those individuals?
Madam Chair, there is capacity in the shelters, and so we would be meeting the standard of having an alternative for people. Now, whether people want that alternative or not, they may not, but that's correct. We'd still have capacity community-wide to shelter everyone.
Okay, and thank you for knowing precisely where I was going with that question of the ability to really tell individuals that they are not allowed to camp because there is an alternative provided. So what happens then? So what happens if they refuse to take one of those options and but
so we revert to what we did before, which was letting people know that they couldn't be camping there. We had a compassionate response at that time, and we continue to do when we need to ask people to move. They're given notification. There's follow-up if they don't move. It's enforced sometimes. And actually, Melissa McDonald could talk about this process. Chief Joy could talk about it. Various parts of our city get involved in making sure the camp is cleared and cleared up afterwards. And so there will still be an element of, kicking the can down the road, for lack of a better analogy, in terms of camps that don't get resolved. But I think we can be in a better, more defensible position, frankly, I think a more ethical position, by having this alternative.
No, I would agree, and I also think, as you've mentioned, the hope is that we do start to create more of a pipeline, and that individuals, we know where they are, so connecting them to those services, building that trust, that ability to really move them forward into independent housing, or at least stable housing. I mean, I think that I've said this multiple times, but there is this I always hate saying this, but there is this reality that there are individuals that are not going to potentially live independently without any supportive services. And so really how we think about that long term is important when we're looking at that overall strategy and how we continue to address this. So I do have a question about the timeline. I did get to look at the matrix of all the sites, and I think that you are correct that Midtown with Consuelo's Place is what makes the most sense, what we can stand up the fastest. And of course there is concern about how we're moving forward with Midtown, and there's been comments from the public of, you guys are just going to turn it into a giant homeless shelter. And I know that this is temporary, and so starting to look, I mean, it's a pretty heavy lift to get us from where we are now to something like the Camp Hope model, or I think I've mentioned to you multiple times Father Joe's Village in San Diego is a very good model. But how we're getting there in a year and a half, or a year and change is kind of the timeline. I won't say a half. Let's do change. This is not computing in my head, so can you please talk a little bit? I mean, that's an aggressive timeline, and it's. I know that part of it is just not just will, but infrastructure and money and how we really create these things. So I'd like to hear a bit more about this off-ramp piece and what this really starts to look like.
Madam Chair, one thing is that we have a one-year contract for services with Consuelo's Place, so that is time-bound, and this would be an expansion of those services. So we would always need, if we were going to expand the timeline and if we wanted to continue to fund Consuelo's, we need to revisit that after or before 1 year. Is that? In terms of all of the other developments at Midtown, you know, that's not my expertise, although I am in communication with Rich Brown and his team. The off-ramp is an aggressive timeline, and I think it's important to have that kind of fire under you to say, we need to come up with a solution. We don't want to go back to the bad old days, right? So maybe what we aren't able to locate a site, build it out in 1.5 years or 1 year, but at least we will know we have a timeline, we have a deadline. Our community partners who now meet regularly have an eye on the prize, and the prize is the off-ramp. I think people agree that, you know, the current status quo is not sustainable. So I can't promise that we'll get there in a year, but I think having that timeline is important. If we have to have another interim solution between that, at least we'll be that much closer to the goal. We've done so much as a community around housing. We can despair. It's very real to despair around the situation, but we've done so much in the last 3 years, in my opinion. We've formed partnerships that have never been formed before. We've committed to collecting data that will inform how many units we actually need, where the gaps in our services are. We've housed people in the suites who were never housed for they were chronically homeless. We now have the Lamplighter project coming on. So I'm optimistic that even if it's a big, ambitious goal, that we can get there, because there's a lot of shared vision and shared momentum here.
Thank you. I do appreciate that. And I do think that the partnerships piece is going to be key. I know you've mentioned, did you just mention Ancorum, or did my head mention Ancorum? Okay. Yeah. And I don't know about some of the other foundations, especially as we start to look at how we pull in other funding resources. And then, Hank, you're not here as a commissioner, but you know what that partnership starts to look like with the county, and really where those impacts are and where those opportunities are, I think is going to be really important. I don't think I have any additional questions right now. I think, you're very correct that this is a solution that doesn't feel like a solution, but I also believe that it is a step in the right direction. And I know that this is a really challenging issue that's going to need to be continually revisited and revamped. And hopefully, as we start to move through a pipeline, it'll be, I really hope that we can see some of those improvements. Thank you for putting out those benchmarks. I think that those will be really important for how we measure our success. That car camping piece is also really interesting. I don't know if we've started to explore that a little bit more as that's come through. So I will go ahead and yield the floor over to Councilwoman Villarreal, and thank you all so much.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you, ladies, for your report and solutions. And I'll be quick because I know folks are getting hungry and ready to have dinner. So I just want to ask you about, have you thought about work opportunities for the folks that are in the sanctioned site? And the reason why I bring that up is a few years ago, before all of your times, I think, all of you, before you actually started working at the city, we tried out Better Way van. You were there. Sorry, Julie. Sorry, you were there. We tried the Better Way van that was modeled after the Albuquerque program that was very successful there. We piloted it. It kind of had its spits and starts, but ultimately, I don't know how that could be incorporated in to be able to utilize folks that do want to work, that we may have worked for them, and maybe you could just tell us what you're thinking.
So a lot of the nonprofit partners that we are going to be partnering with on this project and that we work with in so many other ways, that's a pretty routine part of their work, and a lot of them have great relationships with area businesses to hire their clients. Additionally, a lot of people who are living on the streets and in shelters do have jobs. That's actually a really big reason that many people don't go into shelter. If they work graveyard shifts, shelter doesn't really work for them because it's nighttime and that's when they're at work. So it is a piece of the process that is a critical part of the case management piece of that, but it's not necessarily something I think we've built in a big way.
Okay. I guess I'm just wondering if we would be able to try it out, since we have not just partners, but we've kind of tried it before, and I don't know if Julie has anything to share about it since she experienced it and what didn't work, and why it stopped. I actually don't even know why it stopped, but I know we were piloting it, but.
Yeah, so Madam Chair, Councilor Villarreal, it was actually really successful for the people who were engaged in the program. What happened was there was high turnover of the main case manager driver, and so not having a consistent person being able to run the program really was at a detriment to the clients it was serving. And so right when things were starting to get back on track, just happened to be December of 2019, once the pandemic hit and all services ceased, unfortunately the program ended up folding. Interesting enough, bringing up the Better Way van, part of one of the first projects that Better Way did was actually cleaning Midtown. And so there may be an opportunity for us, once we get this launched, to bring in those partners and start redeveloping maybe some of these workforce opportunities.
That's what I was thinking, but I wanted you to say that. So I think there's an opportunity there that's, easy, accessible, and that we could possibly manage, but I'll leave that up to you all to figure out the details. And then the other last question is just, once this gets into place, which I still wasn't clear about the time frame, we're doing this as soon as possible is kind of what I heard, like the summer?
Madam Chair, yes. Our next step is the permit from the state. We don't know how long that will take. We're working with procurement now on whether this can be emergency procurement, sole source, et cetera. So we think 1 to 3 months, ideally, but I know you'll quote me on that, but I might be wrong, but that's what we hope.
Okay. And I asked just because I wanted to see it, at what point then would we be telling folks that are in encampments and not so safe areas that we would then prioritize to direct them to the folks, to our sanctioned encampment?
Madam Chair, Councilwoman Villarreal, as soon as it's up and running.
Okay. All right. Thank you. That's all I have.
Thank you. And thank you so much, everybody, for your presentation. Really appreciate you being here, and sure we'll see you more to talk more about this soon. Moving on to the first item pulled from consent was item D, pulled by Councilwoman Villarreal. This is a request for approval of the collective bargaining agreement between the City of Santa Fe and the Santa Fe Police Officers Association for FY23 in the amount of $2,251,000, $2.25 million approximately, for sworn and civilian bargaining unit employees. We have Ben Valdez, Deputy Chief of Police, here to present.
Evening.
Good evening. Councilman Villarreal.
Thank you for your patience, DC Valdez and the rest of the staff. I will try to be quick. These are just questions that I had that weren't pertinent to finance and financial implications. And we did cover a little bit about the lateral hires, and I was just wondering if you could confirm, because the language that was taken out was testing that they'd be eligible to test for sergeant after 7 consecutive years. And then so you changed that to 2, but you were talking about how to get to the senior officer, and that takes a certain amount of time. Can you refresh us? Because you did talk a little bit about it in finance, but if you could just elaborate on that.
Madam Chair, Councilwoman Villarreal, so with the change to the laterals eligibility to test for sergeant, we had 7 years with the agency total. What we did see during the interim from last time we changed it until now, which has been about a year or two, is we're losing a lot of opportunities with people that were serving as sergeants or lieutenants with other agencies before they joined our departments. It's also a means to help us encourage people that are serving to other agencies that have that type of background or experience to come to our police department, because that could pose a barrier for them if they have to serve 7 years with the department before they can test for a supervisory position. With the terms, there's 2 criteria. The first, they have to be a senior police officer. So the criteria for that is 5 years of service as a police officer with a law enforcement agency, whether it be Santa Fe Police or with another law enforcement agency that they served with previously. The next criteria is 2 years as a senior police officer with the department. So if they have a minimum of 5 years experience as a law enforcement officer up to 25 years, they join our organization They have to serve a period of 2 years in that position as a senior police officer before they're eligible to test for sergeant. So it's not a guarantee that they are going to be sergeants. It gives them an opportunity to test to compete, and that's leveling the playing field with our staff that we gain as police cadets from the time that they join us until they can be eligible for sergeant. And of those 5 years that be serving with the department, that qualify them for senior police officer, and then those 2 years as senior officer will make that 7.
Thank you. And do you think, I think you said this in the memo, but this was also a recruiting tool as well?
Yes, Councilwoman.
Then there was language, I didn't understand the, what is it, the field training officers and what changed. There was new language about 8 eligible positions, and then what was taken out was auxiliary FTOs, like police officers, police detectives, animal service officers, and it lists those folks, that language was taken out. Can you explain why you swapped what was taken out and then the new language?
Yes, ma'am. So with that, there's a huge inequity there. What we have is a test position for a field training officer, which we have 8 allocated positions for individuals that would receive that incentive pay monthly for serving in that position full-time. Now, if someone were to have a training with them for 1 day, that would make them eligible for the same amount of incentive pay that that person would get for 1 month. So the incentive pay for that is, I believe, $125. Our full-time FTOs, they are the ones we go to when we get a new hire, and we say, hey, look, we have a new hire. They'll be with you for 4 to 6 weeks, and they will have them with them for that time. So they're usually training people anywhere from 6 to 8 months out of the year, having someone with them. And it's a big responsibility for them. It's a huge dedication on their point, because they have to be at work for those times. They have to make sure that they are present to provide that training. If for some reason they're not, they have to make those arrangements to make sure that another FTO is available. But if someone were to be an auxiliary FTO and do 1 day of training, they would also get that $125, which was a huge inequity, for one. The second issue with that as well is in other sections and even in the city, somehow along the lines through the collective bargaining process, they allow to have auxiliary field training officers for animal services, for public safety aides, for other positions in the department. But the field training program was based off the San Jose Police Department field training program, which is to train police officers, not your public safety aides, not your animal services officers. So with that incentive pay, it really didn't make much sense. So when we onboard new staff anywhere else in the city, we do on-the-job training. We do mentorship. We put them with an experienced staff member to show them how to do the process. We don't have a field training process for an HR analyst when they join HR. We don't have a field training process for a new administrative assistant with the San Jose Police Department. They're just trained by staff that have been tenured with the agency that are entrusted to train them. So we wanted to remove that inequity, because for us, we put a huge demand on our field training officers. They are our gatekeepers. They ensure that the staff that we are bringing on board, they're meeting the values of our department, they're meeting the training requirements that we have, and they're going to be good servants for our community. So that's a huge task to take on. Something else we did back in about 2 years ago with our job description for senior police officer. We included in the job description that they are also responsible for training officers, but they're not the ones that are going to be assigned on a full-time basis. So if we do get into a situation where all 8 of our field training officers are assigned to cadets and we get a lateral officer, we still have the means to train that lateral officer in the time while we have those field training officers assigned to do so, because it's in the job description. What we're asking of these 8 is for them to be prepared and ready to train individuals as they're onboarded, whether it be police cadets or lateral police officers.
Great. Thank you for that clarification. That was helpful. And also that you answered my other question, because I said, what if there's more than 8 and you'll have to depend on some other folks? So that's good to hear. The other piece was, I didn't quite understand what was why did this change come about for the officer conferencing language adjustment? Like, how did that come about, and why was the change needed?
Councilman Villalobos, so that was just a clarification. With our policy with the department, we have officer conference and verbal counseling. Now, for our other city employees, it would be a oral coaching or oral counseling that would be reduced to writing. So there was a little bit of variance with that interpretation, and we would just want to make it clear. So the current practice that we've been utilizing with addressing minor infractions or issues, they're using both of the terms interchangeably, officer conference and verbal counseling. So we just made sure that it was clear language, which was in line with our current policy that we've had, and that policy has been in place for some time. I think went back to like 2003, where it had that verbiage in it. But somehow in the CBA, it was used interchangeably, so that's just a clarifying point for that. But that's to address low-level infractions, like if an employee is tardy or if they, had a minor issue come up, like, hey, your reports, they had a lot of errors on this. Here's what you need to correct. It happens again. They can start that low level to address that discrepancy with the employee's work performance.
Got it, thank you. And I guess the other question I was wondering, because it says it doesn't get kept in the person's file or their, the employee file, because it's just, I don't know how you referenced it, but because it was minor, it had to do with like maybe tardiness or other aspects. But what if the supervisor changes and they weren't sure or didn't know about all these other, that they were tardy, that they didn't show up to court dates and whatnot. So I'm just curious, how does that translate to the next person that might be supervising them if it's not in their folder or their file, employee?
So usually what they do is the supervisor will have that item on file. So if the behavior is corrected and if a period of time passes where it's not an issue, then that issue is addressed and is no longer present. Now, if that behavior does continue, it can be utilized for progressive discipline, where they can go for that officer conference to a letter of counseling at that point. And that's something that will go in their file. Now, when there is a transition where we have a change of shift or a change of supervisor, we have that pass on from the previous supervisor to the new one saying, hey, tell me about my staff or anyone facing any type of issues. Is there anything that is in their officer conference that they had any issues with performance? And they do a very good briefing to let them know, so they are brought and apprised of that information. What they'll usually do is get the information, and then they'll hand over to that new supervisor. But depending on their assignment, if it changes, if they get promoted to detective, then that supervisor will convey that to the next supervisor so they're aware of that behavior, and if they do see there's issues that continue, then it can be brought into the realm of progressive discipline at that first level for a letter of counseling if it is that minor infraction.
And what if that supervisor leaves abruptly and can't let folks that take the position know about all their staff and all the things that they should be aware of? How do you all, we're just curious.
So we make sure that happens. That's a big part because we're the highest frequency where we have that supervisor change is usually in the patrol section. So that's something that they do very systematically. That's not something that they would say, well, here's this, because if they're not doing that, they're not being good supervisors, to be frank. If they're not looking at what those issues are, as minor as they are, and with us, we are very nitpicky about things. Like, if you're tardy, then we're going to address it. If there's minor issues, like, we have to make sure that's done. If there's a slight infraction in other departments, it may be okay. With us, it could turn into something that's a performance issue down the road, or it can be an indicator of other behavior that we need to be aware of. So it's very imperative for them to have those conversations to make sure when they're changing supervisors or if there's a shift change, that they talk to those supervisors, say, all right, and they go one by one, tell them about Officer Smith, tell them about Officer Valdez, and they look through all those things. And usually they have a pass-on folder with the information that they give each other, so they're aware of that information. If there's a change as well, what they'll do is, and again, our sergeants are really good. Usually weekly they have a meeting among staff with each other to let them know, hey, here's what's going on. So within that shift, they also know kind of what's going on with the staff as well. So if one of the sergeants is out and they have to cover for that shift, they're aware of what's going on with that employee as well. So it's really important for us to do that because, again, we're very invested in the wellness of our staff. And if there's things that we can do to improve that performance or to address things on the front end, that, again, allows them to correct the behavior, and then they can have a lasting time with us rather than it goes unaddressed and then it starts to snowball, and now we're looking at something where it's a more serious infraction.
Thank you. I had other questions about like how the more serious infractions, where that goes, but that's not part of your change for the for this particular item, so I won't ask you today, but maybe another day. And I just want to let my colleagues know about that something that DC Valdez had brought up at Finance that was disappointing. I kind of knew that it might be a problem, but those of us that were wanting to see a more equitable increase for staff for the folks that, especially AFSCME, was wanting to request more instead of the 8%. What we realized from what DC Valdez said is that AFSCME employees and non-union employees who work at the police department are not going to get a 16% increase. So to me, that's inequitable for them, and it creates kind of this like imbalance within the department. And so I think we need to think about that when we're like thinking about these staff increases and what it means when we're talking about AFSCME and even non-union people, how it affects a full department, because then there's these different levels of what people get in terms of pay increase. So just want to make that point, and thank you for all the information. And I will move to approve.
Is there a second?
Second.
Any other further questions or discussions from the committee? And if not, can I please have a roll call?
Yes.
Yes. Yes.
Yes.
Yes. Thank you so much. Thank you, DC. Moving on to item E, consideration of resolution to be numbered later. A resolution specifying that the down payment assistance program included in the FY23 budget be available to all full-time city employees. We have Alexandra Ladd, which out of lovely surprise, we have Alexandra Ladd here. Always wonderful to see you, Alexandra, here to answer questions. So thank you, Alexandra. And Councilor Chavez, you pulled this. Go right ahead.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And I pulled this item because I've been reflecting on it a lot. I've had many conversations with my colleagues when we were talking about the pay increases through budget. And when I went through my campaign trail, something that came up a lot was public safety. And being in education and having kids and knowing how much I rely on public safety is just in my daily operations, I align very much with my constituents and them wanting to recruit more police, have a larger presence of police in their communities, and, you know, making sure that we're confident with staffing in public safety. So seeing the CBA for police get approved and move and be discussed, and we're having these recruitment and retention strategies to really be competitive, because we need to be competitive. We need to be the best so that we get the best, was really important to me. So seeing all that is, I think, essential in what I want to see just as a community member and what I've heard from constituents. This was another thing that I feel like police could lean on to recruit and for retention. I think really saying we have a program, if you join our team, where we could get you into a house within a community that you protect, was very powerful for them to lean on. But at the same time, I realized that our city staff is amazing, and they work very hard, and they need to feel valued, and they need to feel appreciated. And so I did more digging, because I was like, maybe police wouldn't move. So thanks to Officer Joy and some of the data that he was able to provide, I see that there is, you know, I see in the data that was shared with me, 32 police officers would be interested in living in Santa Fe. Right now, as this states, it's $750,000. So we have more than what even that amount would address in officers interested in moving to Santa Fe. So expanding that would limit that number and address a large issue we have. Like, you know, we just went through there's a horrible situation, so I'm more passionate right now about public safety because of what took place in Texas. It just needs to be made a priority. It's not that all city staff is not a priority, they are. All city staff is a priority. But in the world we live in, we just saw a presentation on violence. We just saw a presentation on needing wraparound services and encampments and addressing drug use and all of the concerns. That all falls on public safety. And so I'm very passionate about the fact that we need to give them as much to lean on as possible to retain and to recruit. I did, though, come over, like, to some information, and I don't know the details of it, so I'm so grateful that Director Ladd is here, that there may be already a fund for down payment assistance for city employees. Is there a partnership with HomeWise where that exists?
Madam Chair, members of the committee, in this, our past request for application process, which is, will go into effect on July 1, 2 programs were awarded funds for a total amount of $900,000 through HomeWise and the Housing Trust. We have also, we're in the process of setting up their administrative contracts, which is separate than the down payment assistance funding, which details how the programs work, how many people they're going to serve, et cetera, et cetera. And in that contract, we are adding language to there's a outreach section. You know, how do you reach people who may not know that homeownership is an option for them? They may not know how the process works. They may not be ready for homeownership, but the sooner they get into a program and help learn how to budget, learn how to pay down debt, fix credit. You know, these organizations are amazing, and sometimes the value of a homeownership training and counseling program is to help people realize you're not quite ready, and you don't want to be in a situation where you can't pay a mortgage. So, but keep working with us. I mean, some folks work with those agencies for years and years. So, in that administrative contract, you know, we are going to specify that we want them to focus their outreach efforts on city staff. They already report to us every time they assist a city staff person.
That's amazing. Thank you for the details, because I was excited by this, because I didn't want to create an assumption that, you know, personally, because I'm bringing this up, didn't value city staff. I very much do. That, I think, is one of the greatest gifts I've experienced so far in my position, is working with city staff and seeing their dedication and their work, and I want them to have opportunities for housing. But I do have to say that when it comes to a priority in keeping our community safe, the priority is law enforcement. And I know this is for first responders. You know, I just mentioned numbers from police. I think there were, I want to say 65, I don't have the numbers in front of me, 65 firefighters that would be interested in living in Santa Fe as well. So that target population for this program is there. We are meeting the need that the community has vocalized. They want to make sure that police is fully staffed. They want them to be in their communities. I had a conversation with a constituent where they were like, in the Balama area, where they said, we used to have police officers that lived in our neighborhood, and we never had these issues. And they see a direct correlation in their experience with those police officers not in their neighborhoods and how crimes have increased. And so I think that the voice is there, the data is there, the need is there. I want to see this stay focused on police, providing Chief Joy and his team with what they need to lean on to recruit and to meet that demanding need that the community has been very vocal and aggressive about. And I don't know, Chief Joy, if you want to speak to any of it, anything that I've said so far, but I just really wanted to communicate that I see it. I personally relate as a community member. I personally relate hearing from constituents as a leader. They seek and saying, how are we addressing this? How are we addressing public safety? What is the police doing? What is the police doing? I feel very uncomfortable with speaking for you all when I'm not positive as a city we aren't giving you everything you need to recruit and retain. But we're on our way now, and I think this is essential in doing it.
Madam Chair and Councilwoman Chavez, you hit the nail on the head a couple of different times in a couple of different ways. There's really not a whole lot more for me to add to that. This is this on top of the contract that you all just approved, which I'm also grateful for. This is a multi-pronged approach for us to be very aggressive with our recruiting as well. And so, yeah, we had 61 respondents, I believe, that's off the top of my head now, of the roughly 112 sworn union members. So that doesn't include cadets of the poll that was asked, but that's going to be, obviously these are new officers that are just coming in, that we're just onboarding. If we can add that as an incentive for them as well to help them in their young career, to bring them in and bring them here to Santa Fe, it's another tool for the toolbox, I guess, for lack of a better term.
I completely agree. So, the last thing I'll say is I really feel like this should be a program that's focused on, as it was originally, first responders. And Director Ladd, you said everything that kind of addressed my concerns. And will city employees know about the $900,000 available for housing assistance or education? I think us just messaging that out and making sure they feel targeted as people we want to be involved in that and take advantage of it is important. I think with that, we're showing value to all employees in Santa Fe, but we are also providing a resource to lean on for a department that has great demand and meeting a need that's huge in Santa Fe. So thank you guys both for your time, and that's all I have to say. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Councilor Chavez. Councilor Michael Garcia.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And, I guess maybe I want to take this moment to clear up some misconceptions. First and foremost, this proposed amendment does not take a single thing away from our police officers or firefighters. By no means does it say that police officers or firefighters won't be eligible. Nobody is saying that those two respective departments are not a priority. What this amendment is saying is our entire workforce is a priority. We have an average of 20% vacancy across our city right now. You look at our department with the highest vacancy rate, which is finance, which is, surprise, surprise, been in the media for the last month because it's been our biggest challenge. These are incentives that help us recruit, as Councilor Chavez mentioned. This is an incentive that can help us recruit a finance director. This is an incentive that could help us fill the gaps throughout the entire workforce for our city. Not only that, this proposed amendment shows that we care about every single and full-time employee. Whether you are a person that is picking up trash or a person that is protecting our streets, what we are saying here is we value you. We want you to live in our community. And what we're seeing right now with the outflux is with our staff, the folks that are currently eligible for this. We are seeing so many of our city staff have to move to places like Pecos, Los Alamos, Rio Rancho, not Los Alamos, Las Vegas. They can't afford to live here. And we need to be doing everything we can to provide the opportunity for every single full-time employee to have the opportunity to live here. Now, it was spoken about data. Well, let's conduct a survey of all city employees. I'm sure folks would be shocked. It'd be a heck of a lot more than 32 folks that would say, yes, I want to live here. And when we have the data that, unfortunately, Chief Joy, that is not a comprehensive data set. If we can get all 112 uniformed officers or 112 folks to respond, fantastic, we can move forward with that. But right now, that data is invalid. Not saying that those 32 folks wouldn't move here. What I'm saying is if we're going to look at data, let's do it the right way, or else it's not qualified data. And so with that, then let's do a survey. Let's work with AFSCME and with all of our other unions to see who would really want to take advantage of this opportunity. I think it's being misconstrued that, you know, this proposed amendment is taking away. This is only adding. And I think what we're missing here is not only the fiscal component, but the morale value that comes along with this. I mean, if we want to be real, let's be real. Morale of city employees is down in the dumps. We need to be doing everything we can to bring them up. And if that means providing an opportunity for folks to live here, great. If that means we've got to figure out how to come up with additional resources so we can expand this program, let's do it. We're smart. We can make it happen. And I'm great to hear about the additional resources that's available. Fantastic. Even more folks that could take advantage of an opportunity to live here in the city. But I'm not going to kind of take the narrative and have that false narrative of this is taking away from our police officers and firefighters. It's not. It is not at all. This is only adding that additional benefit to all city employees. So with that, I'll make a motion to approve.
Second.
Further questions or discussion from the committee? Councilwoman Villarreal?
Thank you, Madam Chair. So just to clarify with Alex, because we've had a lot of conversations about this, and I'm also chairing the CDC, so we see the amount of money that comes forth for down payment assistance. And we had talked about this during the budget, about having language in their contract that would say their outreach, that they would do more outreach with city staff. The thing about that is that they can do outreach, but it doesn't target or prioritize city staff. So what happens is that money is actually just a large amount, a pool of money that anyone first come, first served that actually qualifies would get it. And we want that because we want other people in the community to also be able to have resources for down payment assistance. So it doesn't directly target it, and that's what I was trying to figure out with Director Ladd about how we could actually be more specific. And this doesn't do it. I mean, it helps, but it doesn't get to like the crux of what we're trying to do is supporting more city staff for down payment assistance. There is another way that Alex and I were talking about, but I'm forgetting another option, but it doesn't really pertain to this kind of effort. I think we need to brainstorm about that maybe there's other ways that our city resources would directly specify that this needs to support city staff. But we need to, I want to talk to Alex more about that. I guess I just want to see us, even with the outreach you all have done, there is limitations. I mean, it's based on your income. So even if folks were like, yes, I want to do it, there's some people that will not in our law enforcement be able to qualify, unfortunately. And $750 is not that much money. We know that. I mean, we've been talking about raising the down payment assistance. I guess I wanted to see this happen with this change because when we start looking at budget adjustments later on in the year, then we can actually request for more funding to be put into this and be able to find the funding so that we can increase the amount so that it actually does have there's a larger pool of funding to draw from. But I think that putting this in place will help to start the process so that if this is in place, then when we start asking for budget adjustments, then we can actually have the language infrastructure saying that all city employees are eligible. Obviously, it's based on income, and they have to go through the house buying process, which could be years, like Alex is saying. I just wanted to be able to have a pathway so that we can be able to look at this this program as including all city staff. That's why I'm supporting it. It does need a budget adjustment, though, for it to be viable. So I'd like us to see this pathway move forward, and then when we get to that point, to ask for more funding to infuse in it. And in the meantime, I'll be working with Alex to see if there's other pathways, because the $900K, it's a great option. We have the down payment assistance. It just doesn't target and shepherd our city staff to go through that process and really say, okay, you're a priority, we're going to focus on city staff. It really says, yes, we want to help you, we're going to give you the resources, but we have all these other people in the city that are also vying for that same amount of down payment assistance. So it doesn't, again, get to like the prioritization that I'm seeking, I guess, to really look at the staff as a whole, because you know, there's a lot of essential workers, as I said in budget hearings. I think we have so many essential workers in different departments, and law enforcement is obviously one of them, but there's so many things that we do in the city to make our basic services function, and if we had people that actually saw and were part of what they were doing in the city, to see the fruits of their labor, whether it's in the parks, and be able to live here and see that, I think it's just an advantage and important for all of us. So that's all I'll say for today. Thank you.
Councilwoman. Councilor Lee Garcia.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Just a few comments in regards to what I've heard, what I've, gone through my own thought process in this resolution. When you look at any organization, you see the competitive nature that it is out there for hiring people, and I see how valuable of a tool this can be for first responders, not to take away from the police department, not to take away from the fire department, but to allow each department to develop sort of what is a benefits package and how to bring people in as part of recruitment, how to retain people. And I think that's very important overall. And when you look at the overall organizational chart of the city, I think this helps. And I do agree that $750,000 isn't going to go very far, even within just one department, depending on how the criterion is laid out, how it's going to work, how the program's going to work. Going back to assistance programs that are available to people that work for the city, just the community in general, I think is great information to have out there, and I think a lot of people do know about those programs. But here again, going back to what the city can offer to their employees in regards to the overall benefits package and how the city can utilize this as a tool. I do agree that funding would need to be increased, and I think something along the lines would have to happen. And I think this starts off that conversation, and it allows us to move into that next phase of, okay, now we can do a budget adjustment and bring more funds into this, and how do we grow this over the year? And this is the open door opportunity for us right now. And so I do believe that, and those are my comments. And thank you. I do support this.
Thank you, Counselor. Alexandra, I have a couple questions. When this was coming through on budget hearings, this program really had not been designed. What are the amounts that people would get? What are the income thresholds? What are the requirements for people who are receiving this and then remaining in the city? All of those components, have those program components been designed yet and decided upon?
Madam Chair, members of the committee, I'm glad you asked that question, because I think as the person who's likely to be very involved in how the program is developed and how the funds get out into the community, I would say that I do not understand the policy priority behind this program. I can think of 15 of them, but to say, well, yes, all of the above, are we trying to retain employees? Are we trying to attract employees? Are we trying to address housing instability? Are we trying to reduce extreme housing costs? There are many, many reasons why people can't afford housing, and it's not just because they don't have down payment assistance. That's a huge piece of it. it'll help immensely for many people, but it's only going to help the people who are credit ready, who don't have big debt loads, and have the wherewithal to go through that process. So I think that would be very helpful, because there are lots of different ways to design this. If staff understands what the policy priority, are you throwing a handful of pebbles into the pond and hoping that a ripple hits the opposite shore, or are you taking a big boulder and focusing on one part of the pond and really making an impact? I'm not saying either way is right or wrong, but that would be very helpful for, I'm not a policymaker, I'm supposed to be executing this. So that's what I haven't heard. I haven't heard the policy priority articulated, because that's also the only way to measure whether the intervention is effective. Because if we don't know what we're trying to do, what we're trying to accomplish, we can get this money out the door, we can help a lot of people. Have we moved the needle? We have no way of knowing.
Thank you. I agree. I think that's part of this conversation here is really that. That's exactly what we were debating at this moment. Alexandra, you brought up another point, which is that even if somebody has down payment assistance, there are all these other factors, and one of the factors is you still have to make monthly payments. And given our housing market, how big of a down payment how much down payment assistance is needed to really make enough of a dent that individuals can afford it? We just raised our down payment assistance because essentially there wasn't anything on the market at what our previous level was. We raised up to up to 80,000, correct?
Madam Chair, for the community development block grants, we raised it to 80,000 because when a home buyer family is earning 80% of area median income, that is even less buying power than obviously somebody at 100% of area median income.
Have we explored, I believe that there are other cities that basically provide housing stipends, that for cities that are very expensive to live in, they will provide housing stipends for individuals to take positions in the city. And those, I'm curious if we have looked at any of those programs as opposed to specific down payment assistance, if we've looked at whether it's a monthly or annual stipend that helps with the housing costs of exceptionally high areas.
Madam Chair, members of the committee, that's a great question. I know of programs that are offered through employers in the private sector. A lot of times educational institutions, sometimes nonprofits, or big corporate employers will create a program called employer-assisted housing is usually what it's called, and sometimes they master lease a big block of rental units for their employees to live in, or they will provide housing assistance to purchase homes as a benefit. What the big complication, and I wish Director Salazar was here, in this organization is that we have unions. How do we make that fair if somebody gets a down payment assistance loan from the city and somebody else doesn't get it? Like if it becomes a benefit for the employees, and this is not my neck of the woods, so I have no idea how this would work, but it's very much more complicated because we're a public entity and unionized.
Yeah, that does definitely add another piece of this. Regarding the down payment assistance program that is that we already have going in the city, how quickly is that tapped? I know we're not the only funder for it, so we are not the only ones that provide, right? We are not the only ones that provide dollars to essentially HomeWise. I think that they're the only ones acting in this arena. How quickly are they tapped on their down payment assistance? Do they have money all the time? Are you waiting on an annual basis? I know our specific dollars from the Affordable Housing Trust Fund, or CDBG, run out, but I'm curious about what their financing looks like in general.
Madam Chair, members of the committee, usually the local funds, which are less restricted and can serve higher incomes, they are very quickly expended both Habitat, also HomeWise and the Housing Trust all have access to other financial resources. Housing Trust and HomeWise are financial institutions themselves, so they make their own loans sometimes if they have an unconventional borrower. So the federal funds are a little harder because they're just less flexible, and the income restriction is for a lower income. So those are the funds that we've had a hard time with. The market increases, the price increases in the market, that gap has gotten really large. But generally, they don't leave money on the table, ever.
Okay, so dollars get expended quickly. That's the end of that story. Okay. How many individuals do we think that $750,000, if we could hazard a guess with a reasonable down payment assistance, I know it's not designed yet, how many do we think we could actually help?
Madam Chair, members of the committee, it's all dependent on the individual home buying household and what their income is, and et cetera, et cetera. But I think I would assume we would be somewhere in the neighborhood of $50,000, $40,000 to $50,000 per household.
And I would assume that when we are looking at this, we will be looking at the entire household. So if somebody works for the city, maybe they're lower income, but they have a spouse who makes a good amount of money somewhere else, I'm assuming that they would not be eligible? You don't know.
Madam Chair, members of the committee, the entire income for the whole household is considered, so that could certainly price them out of a conventional housing product. The council, again, back to what is the policy priority here, the council could say, we don't want it to be income restricted. We want to serve anybody who is a worker in this organization and wants to live here, in which case we would not be able to provide a low-cost product. We would have to provide a loan with, and there are various ways to structure that, but that is also an option.
Yeah, I think this is one of the parts that I've really struggled with this decision in general, is that so many unknown details at the moment that I have struggled a lot. I mean, honestly, I've gone back and forth with this particular item since budget hearings. Who knows? I may go back and forth between committees. This one is really challenging for me. On the one hand, Santa Fe is extremely unaffordable. I mean, we're an unaffordable city. And there are a lot of individuals who are working at the city who cannot afford to live at the city. And I think that there really is, I think that that's a really strong recognition. This is a problem, although it's not just a problem for us. This is a problem for everybody, for businesses everywhere in our community. On the other side of that equation, as Councilor Chavez mentioned, in no uncertain terms, every single community meeting, every single constituent meeting I have had in my district has emphasized the desire for more police presence, the desire for police officers to be living in our community. When I also think about it kind of in some of our more holistic goals for policing, as we're thinking about policing, there's the conversation on community policing seems to have almost I don't hear about it as much, but I know that there was a lot of conversation about, what does this start to look like when you know officers, when you have officers that are members of your community that you're interacting with at your kids' school, when you're interacting with them at the grocery store, at all these areas, which I know sometimes for officers, I've heard that can actually be a deterrent for them to wanting to live in Santa Fe, that they do have experiences where there's somebody that they've arrested and they run into them at the grocery store when they're there with their kids, and that's not something that they're really comfortable with. And so I think that that's almost a little bit two-sided there of how we how we address this. I have a really hard time with our car take-home program. I hate how far we allow our cars to drive. I worry about gas, I worry about money, you know, and I understand where the arguments are, and so I prefer to have officers living closer to the city, or at least in our county, although we've discussed that Edgewood's actually even further than Rio Rancho. But how do we start to really bring individuals in? I will also say, while every position, as we know, is crucial for the operating, there are really only two classifications of employees that put their life on the line when they go to work every day. Yes, accidents happen, of course. We could never say that did not occur, but they are categorically more putting themselves in more danger, and so I do think that there is a component there. So I'm not sure. I've really struggled with this one. I do think that there is, if we're going to look at what is the policy goal, does this work? Having a smaller pool helps because your total N, your total population is lower. That's why I was curious about kind of some of these other programs like housing stipends that maybe aren't going to require $50,000, and so there's this capability to reduce the total number that we might be, or total amounts that we're looking at, and therefore be able to really see how this could impact a larger percentage of our employee population, our total population. But yeah, I have found this one really challenging, and I do also know that there has been a really big call from my constituency for increased public safety, for having enough officers, and having them within our community, and yeah, I'm a little bit at a loss with this one. I'm very much at a loss with this one, actually. So I will yield the floor. If there are no more comments or questions, we can go ahead and call for a vote.
Can I make one more comment?
Yes, Councilor Chavez.
Thank you. I wanted to follow up on some comments that were made. I do think this would be taking something away from first responders, because I think that we are providing them with language for recruitment and retention and saying we as a city appreciate our law enforcement, appreciate our first responders, and we have this program in our city built specifically for them. And that is powerful. That is powerful in recruiting and having a target group, especially those that run towards danger, and saying, yes, we expect you to, as Chief Joy and I said, I had a conversation with him where he was, as a mother, and about gun violence, and he basically said what Councilor Cassett said is our police are trained to run towards danger. If they're there, they respond instantly. That is what they're expected to do. They respond to save lives immediately. And I think when someone has signed up for that career, which heroes really are, you guys are, so thank you. I can't express my appreciation. I think that it's important for when we're recruiting them and bringing them into our community for them to know they will be valued and appreciated and celebrated by the community they serve and they run towards when they're in danger. And I think that this really specifies when he's having those recruitment conversations, our city has a program specifically built for us because of that value and appreciation. So I think when that is taken away, it changes. It takes the power away from what that housing assistance is for that target population. So I just wanted to make that comment because I think that is what's taken away, is how powerful that can be used in recruiting officers, which we desperately need right now.
Councilor Garcia?
Thank you, Madam Chair. And I guess I got a question for my co-sponsor. Councilor Garcia, would a police officer still be eligible for the down payment assistance program should this resolution pass?
The answer is yes. Again, it's available to everyone, and I think that's what we're trying to achieve here.
Would the program be available to firefighters?
Yes.
Can it still be used as a recruitment tool for both departments?
Yes.
Okay, so it's clear, crystal clear. Nothing is being taken away. We're only adding. I think there's a commitment from at least the majority of the counselors on the dais up here that we want to begin to immediately look at expanding the resources for this program because we do see the need. And we want to ensure that we are not putting anybody at a disadvantage. So with that, this program just opens up opportunity. It doesn't close any doors. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Counselor. Ms. Martin, roll call, please.
No.
Yes.
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 Moving on. No. Thank you so much. Thank you for being here. We have no discussion, no executive session. Matters from staff.
I have no matters, Madam Chair.
Thank you. Any matters from the committee? None? Okay. I have no matters. Our next meeting is Wednesday, June 15th, and we are adjourned at 7:41 p.m. Thank you.